this work is centered on the religious community that gather around smyon Heruka. So it's a historical study that is focused on 15th and 16th century Tibet, but then follows the community up to the 18th century. So smyon Heruka is best known as one of the leading holy madmen of Tibet, as well as the compiler of the widely read versions of the life and songs of Milarepa. So you see here a statue of the master in which he is portrayed as a yogin with long matted hair and bearing tantric implements. I have reported here a stanza of homage from a prayer to the master and to his students. That is one of the main sources that I employed in the book. Indeed, the main subject of the research is the religious community, so that gathered around this teacher, and how it developed after his death. I'm trying to, okay. So the sources that I employed are mainly of a literary nature. So the texts compiled by members of the school, which include hagiographies of past masters, history, songs, prayer, and text of tantric practice. Some biographers of members of the school, which then were also a product of their disciples. And some of these biographies also include some documents, such as registers of donations, letters, and travel documents. As I will mention, members of the school employed the printing technology on quite a wide scale. And so we have sometimes very extensive printing colophons with their donations list that then offer also a glimpse into the community that were contributing to these enterprises, these printing enterprises. And so we can also locate particular members of the school in time and place thanks to these colophons. Then, of course, I also employed other kinds of life stories and histories of children, and also some genealogies of specific families, clans that were supporting members of the school, royal genealogies and abbatial genealogies. Also records of teachings received, senyek, that were used to trace the transmission of the specific teachings of Smyon and his disciples, and some sources on sacred geography and pilgrimage to gather information on the main temples, monasteries, and hermitages of the community. And finally, when available, I try to locate visual representations of the masters, such as book illustrations, tankas, and statues. So by studying these sources, I try to reconstruct the community's network of patrons and disciples, monasteries and hermitages, and literary production. And in this way, I try to investigate how this community grew, who were the main agents of its development after the death of the madman, and which were its main markers of identity, of the specific group identity of this community. And I suggest that it may be understood as a reform movement that found fertile ground of development in the Tibetan religious and political context of Tibet's 15th and 16th centuries. So this was a time of frequent wars and conflicts accompanied by cultural and artistic efflorescence. We witnessed the gradual breakup of the political order, where noble houses controlled a certain territory also by means of monastic establishments. At the fall of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Padmandrupa, some of these houses weakened and others gained greater military power, and the old alliances between the religious and political powers were renegotiated. Different Buddhist orders competed for the protection and sponsorship of the most important and powerful families. The traditional system of succession to high religious office, the so-called uncle-nephew system, often revealed itself as no longer apt to the new circumstances and was displaced by new reincarnation lineages. New monasteries were established and new orders came to prominence. The most famous and eventually successful of them is, of course, the Gelugpa. But the rise was by no means an isolated phenomenon. The regional political powers in Western Tibet, including those such as the Rinpoche based in Tsang, who had hegemonic aspirations over central Tibet, supported and sponsored a number of charismatic religious leaders whose communities of followers remained in the fold of existing orders, such as the Sakyapa or the Kagyupa or the Bodumpa, but which represented a vital force of renewal of their traditions and presented distinct answers to a time of instability. So in my study of the school of Tsanyon, so I call it this way, but of course it never became a distinct order like the Gelugpa, but it was a distinct religious group. So I could identify a number of characteristics of both its religious rhetoric and its modus operandi that show how, while remaining firmly within the Kagyu school, where they received support from the powerful Karma Kagyu hierarchs of the time, in particular the seventh Karmapa, they represented themselves as a distinct community and operated as a reform movement. These elements are common also to the establishment of the Gelugpa. So the rhetoric was a perceived age of decline or degeneration of the teachings, and the, let's say, the aspiration to retrieve the original, the most authentic religious lore that defined the origins of the Kagyu order, the Kagyu school. And we see a charismatic leader, Tsanyon, who by taking up a religious persona that was defined by this madness, by this holy madness, so by this unconventional behavior, was able to attract the attention, the protection, and the sponsorship of important rulers, regional rulers of the time in Western Tibet. His biographies emphasize the visionary links with deities and masters of the past, especially Milarepa, as we will see. And there is, throughout the first generations of the school, this rewriting of the past, so of the lives of the members of the early Kagyu school, in order to forge the religious identity of the community. We find the support of raising political powers, in particular the two powerful strongmen of the time, which were the Jawa ruler, Tashidagye, and the Rinpoche strongman Döngyö Dorje, who allied and fought against the noble families of the area of which were in the area of Lhasa, and who were the main patrons of the also newly established Gelug school, and were eventually able to conquer Lhasa in 1498. Tsanyon Heruka joined his patrons in the city in 1507 and was poisoned there, or maybe at the end of 1506, let's say, but at the end of his life. So while his patrons were controlling the city, at the end of a very long conflict, he joined his patrons there, but was poisoned there. And that's how he died. Another element, which is a characteristic of the school and for which it is very well known, and which was also, in fact, adopted by the early Gelug school, is the employ of a printing technology. So, as you know, printing in Tibet was adopted at the beginning of the 15th century. And so by the time of Tsanyon, so at the end of that century, was a relatively new technology, which needed funding and manpower to be able to function. In fact, Tsanyon's printing of his masterwork, The Life and Songs of Milarepa, was, to my knowledge, the earliest such printing project that was sponsored at the grassroots level. So he had offerings from main noble houses and royal houses of Western Tibet, but he also gathered funding through alms round. While until then, the main printing projects that we knew of were all by initiative of noble houses themselves, and were so royal productions. So the movement's principal icon is Milarepa, whose life and teachings are the subject of Tsangyong's masterful retelling. The community appropriated for itself this revered figure of the past, settled down at sites that were connected or connected anew by narrative means and visionary means with this figure, and promoted it as the paragon of the Kagyu values. Already in the madman's preaching, Milarepa takes center stage in the symbolic constellation. Indeed, he taught a series of esoteric teachings that were previously a marginal and restricted tradition, which were held to be the secret teachings of the yogin. So Tsangyong not only retold the life story of Milarepa, but he also, in his preaching, put at the center the oral transmission of Samvara, the Danish of Nyingyud, which were considered as the core of the teaching of Milarepa's teachings. Spreading and popularizing an esoteric yogic tradition was a remarkable move, and the rhetorical instruments that accompanied it had to be adequate to the task. They involved evoking the impending degenerate age of the teachings, when there is fear of losing the most rare and precious instructions, and the need for swift and efficacious means to attain liberation. The oral transmission instructions were presented as the adequate answer to both needs, since, according to their preachers, they introduce the pupil directly to the ultimate truth, are devoid of any useless layers of words, do not require subtle interpretation or philosophical inquiry, do not trap the pupil in time-wasting doubts and debates over the canonical scriptures and their possible understandings. According to the madman's biographies, the choice of propounding this set of teachings was inspired by a visionary encounter with Vajrayogini, who appeared to the madman when he was pondering to write a commentary to the Hevajra Tantra, and somehow changed the course of his future endeavors. Noble one, so Vajrayogini appears to Tsangyong and says, "Noble one, there are already many commentaries on the Hevajra Tantra composed by Indian and Tibetan scholars. In this degenerate age of conflict, sentient beings have short lives, many illnesses, and inferior intellect. They teach and learn the tantras, but through their mental elaborations such as these, they do not enhance the benefit of beings. If you clarify the meaning of the wish-fulfilling gems of the oral transmission, you will accomplish the benefit of the doctrine and of sentient beings." Moreover, the main areas of activity of Tsangyong were the so-called 3 snowy mountain abodes of Samvara, so the mountains of Tise, Lach, and Sari, which were considered residents of the deity of Chakrasamvara, and this where he performed repeated long retreats, and where he performed some of his most famous also mad acts or miracles, where he also had visions of the deity. And this kind of activity is often referred to in the prayers and the compositions of the school as to plant the victory banner of accomplishment at the 3 snowy mountain abodes. And by this shorthand or this shortcut, one finds somehow a reference to building religious or leading religious groups in these 3 mountain abodes. And in fact, we know from the sources that in time they grew 3 hermitages, one in each of the 3 sacred mountains, led by the disciples of Tsangyong. And here you see on the map in this red where so Tise, Lapchi, and Sari. So this is basically the extent of the activity of Tsangyong, which traveled throughout all his life among these 3 main areas, and was supported by, so in Western Tibet, by the kingdom of Lobo-Montang, in, let's say, Western Tibet, which in the schools literature is actually called the middle regions, by the ruling houses of Mangyul Guntang and Latu, and of course by the strongmen of Tsang, and then he also in Sari by the Ja leader, Tashi Dargye, that I already mentioned. So at the death of Sanyong Heruka, his students furthered the work. And at the beginning, they were led by the deceased master's consort, Kuntunsang Mo, who showed the way forward, prompting the composition and printing of the biography and the collected songs of Sanyong. So the first telling of the three major versions of the life story of the master. As well as she ordered the renovation of the storage house in Yanang, so near Lapchi, where the blocks were kept, and also where the blocks of the life and songs of Milarepa were kept. And she also led the renovation of these blocks of the life and songs of Milarepa. She also initiated the composition and printing of the life stories of Tilopa in Naropa, starting to widen the lineage narrative. So Sanyong had already, in the last years of his life, in 1505, composed and printed the life story of Marpa. And so Kuntunsang Mo went back in time and instructed one of the main disciples to compose a new version of the life story of Tilopa and Naropa, and then she sponsored their printing. In the second part of her life, she traveled to U, where she is instrumental in the foundation of the new hermitage of Reshumpug in Yarlung and in determining its early abbatial succession. And I will talk about this in a minute. So the disciples of Sanyong are usually distinguished in two groups. And a prayer, for example, lists by name 49 her heart disciples, distinguishing between those who adorned their body with the implements of the charnel grounds, like the master, and those wearing the attire of ordained monks. Similar lists, for example, dividing the disciples into those famed in the west, in the middle regions, and in the east being Yarlung, allow to reconstruct the extent of the community of the followers of Sanyong. Most of these individuals remain only names, but for some we have full-length biographies. We have about maybe 10 or 12 full-length biographies of some of these teachers. So we can gain new insight into the trajectories and contributions of these pupils, as well as to the developments of the school after the demise of Sanyong. And we can see that, for example, Lopan Champal Chola, who was the kind of attendant of Sanyong, we can now know a little bit more about what his deeds were and what text he printed and composed and so on. So we start having a little bit of access to some of the less known figures of this entourage. And in this way, we can see also the impact that the school had on the Tibetan religious landscape. In the writing, Sanyong Heruka is put forward as the re-embodiment or the emanation of Milarepa, who is the prophesied teacher of the oral transmission of Sambara, of these specific esoteric teachings, and who has taken birth for the sake of spreading these hard teachings during the degenerate times. As his predecessor, he is shown having multiple visions and powers and magical powers, as well as being a spontaneous source of Vajra sounds or pur. In this way, Sanyong Heruka comes to embody the ideal of the Kagyu Yogin, and as such, his life and deeds are a model as much as the life of Milarepa is. His life story is intimately related to his masterwork and is constructed by his disciples as a paragon in close relationship with it and with the whole literature of the school. So if we look at the whole literature of the school, basically it becomes a kind of play of mirrors and references between the past and the present, and in which the key point is the identification of Sanyong with Milarepa. And this is explicitly stated in his longest biography. But also in this we see plays like, so the Sanyon Heruka's master becomes equated with Marpa, although of course he's not seen as the emanation of Marpa. But in some of the prayers or of the images, he's equated with him. And his main disciples, according to their, if they are yogins or monks, are equated with Rechunpa or Gampopa and are seen as their emanation or reincarnation, or just equated with them. So the disciples that were active in Western and Central Tibet furthered the work of Sanyon, both in all these three main areas of activity. So they widened very much the scope of the hagiographical writings of the school, producing and also printing the lives and the songs of many early Kagyu masters that were relevant to local religious history, such as Tilopa and Naropa, already mentioned, but also Rechunpa, Gampopa, Padmodrupa, Gotsampa Gompo Dorje, Yangompa, Lingrepa, Tsampagyare, Lorepa, and Mitra Yogi. They also composed and printed commentaries and ritual text on the oral transmission of Sambara. And there is evidence that this set of teachings was what was practiced in particular at the centers of the school. And they also widened the network of hermitages, founding at least 4 of them after the death of the madman, Rechunpug in Yarlum, Drakartartso and Oselpug in Mangyul, and Bektselu in in Latulu. This is near the Palkutso, a little bit east of the Palkutso. I have a map here where you can see, so these are Drakartartso and Oselpug, this is Bektse, and this is Rechunpug. From these, especially Rechunpug and Drakartartso, now I will talk a little bit more about them, because they were they remained active until, well, until now. They're still active, and during the 17th and 18th century, they were the hub from which the transmission, the tradition in lineages of transmissions that were mingled with Nimapa Terma, so treasure transmission lineages, spread into the Himalayas. So in this map, you see the areas in which the tradition spread. So where we find lineages of transmission of the oral transmission of Sambara that come through Sanyon Heruka and his disciples, or families, Lama lineages in the Himalayas that descend from disciples or members of the school, or hermitages founded by members of the school. In the next map, you see that, so we find these traces in Dolpo, in Yishang, in Tsumnugri, in Yolmo, and also in the Sherpa region, where there is evidence that the first monastic establishments were founded by a master who had links, who was a disciple of this Lopan that I showed you before, and who had then links with the school of Sanyon Heruka. So the members of the school were also active or involved with the opening of Beyul, of so hidden valleys in the Himalayas, and thus they had a profound impact on the religious history throughout the borderlands. It is important to note that this allows us today to actually have access to the documentation to reconstruct this history, because the main part of my sources come from the fund that was filmed by the Nepal-German Manuscript Preservation Project, especially in those areas. So books that were that preserve texts composed by or printed by members of the school are still extant in these areas and were filmed, and I was able then to use them for this research. So Rechungpuk, of the two main centers in Tibet that were the hubs for this diffusion, Rechungpuk is the one that is found in this ridge that separates the Yarlung Valley from the Chongye Valley. Hugh Richardson was there in 1949, and he took the only known photograph of the site before its destruction during the Cultural Revolution that you see here. And this is how it looked in 2016 when I was there. So you see the ruins of the old place and the new temple that was built here. This is the view from the ridge on the opening of the valley. This is the statue of Rechungpa in the main temple. And this is these are the most let's say, sacred items in the place, which are the footprint of Tsanyong and a tantric staff of Milarepa or of Tsanyong. The two figures are often blended. So Rechungpuk is called like this because it was, according to tradition, it was constructed on a cave, Pug of Rechungpa, so one of the main disciples of Milarepa. And it is the place where Tsanyong Heruka eventually died. So he was poisoned in Lhasa, but wanted to travel down to Tari, but he never made it to his final destination and finally passed away in Rechungpuk. The hermitage there was founded by initiative basically of Kuntun Sangmo. And eventually, after a few years, it was entrusted to gTsang Rinchen, who was a very young disciple of Tsanyong, who had joined him quite late in his life. gTsang Rinchen is also the compiler, the one who compiled and printed the most extensive life story of Tsanyong Heruka, which is the one that puts forward the belief that Tsanyong is the reincarnation of Milarepa in the strongest terms and the clearest terms. He was also very involved in the teaching of the oral transmission. And eventually, and he also compiled and printed what became the standard life story of Rechungpa himself. So as Tsanyong Heruka, who rewrote anew the life story of Milarepa, is seen by his disciple as the emanation of Milarepa, then of course gTsang Rinchen will be seen as the reincarnation of Rechungpa. So the strong edification between the disciple and the master. And in the life story of Milarepa, as you know, it is in the version of Tsanyong, it is Milarepa himself who tells his life story to Rechungpa. And as such, gTsang Rinchen is as the biographer of Milarepa, of Tsanyong, that thus of Milarepa, of course, becomes also identified with Rechungpa. So you see, there is such a very strong, really a very strong parallel between the hagiographies of the way in which these masters are seen as represented in their biographies by their disciples and their models in the past, namely Milarepa and Rechungpa. And here you even see gTsang Rinchen represented in an illustration of the life of Rechungpa that he composed and printed, and he is seated between two disciples of Milarepa, namely Kyung Tsampa and Sumston Repa. Suntonreva. So basically, he sits as Rechungpa in the middle of the disciples of Milarepa. Here you see, I will not go into great detail about this, but here you see I was able to reconstruct the successive seed holders of the site. And in bold, you see that there was a reincarnation lineage of Gotsan Rinchen that developed at the site. So we have Drupto Wangpo, the emanation of Gotsan Rinchen, and then we have Damlin Dorje. Here he's called the emanation of Tsanyong, but he is seen as the reincarnation of Drupto Wangpo in other sources, in some of the biographies. And this Damlin Dorje, you can see, is Chojelimpa, Terchen Chojelimpa. So he's the very well-known treasure finder, and that. And here, and in fact, in Rechungpuk, there used to be a statue of this master in the attire of a Karma Kagyu master, instead of in the attire of a treasure finder or a Bayul opener, so the opener of the of Secret Valley. There was also another reincarnation lineage at the head of Rechungpuk, and this was linked to another institution in Tsang, namely Chanchubling, of which very little is known today. From Rechungpuk, so disciple of Drupto Wangpo traveled to Yolmo, so to Helambu in the Himalayas, and founded there the most important lay Lama lineage of the valley, which also headed many of its temples. So basically, the spread of Buddhism in Yolmo is intimately linked with Drupto Wangpo and with Rechungpuk. On the other side, Drakartaso, which is found in Mangyul in Kirong, was established by another of Tsanyong's disciple, Hwatsun Rinchen Namgyel, in 1525. This, here in the next slide, you see a statue of Hwatsun that is found in Drakartaso itself. Of Drakartaso, we have more information on the success of the seats, succession at the seat, because we have a Denrab, a Bashal genealogy, written at the beginning of the 19th century, but one of the latest, but by the seat holder of the time, Drakartaso Tulkuchuki Wanchuk, and I edited and translated this section of the Denrab until the 17th century during the tenure of Karma Lobsang. Karma Lobsang was, we don't have the exact dates, although we have his biography, but he lived in the 17th century, and he was extremely active. He was still a teacher of the oral transmission of Samvara. So at this time, in these two places at least, Rechungpuk and Drakartaso, the oral transmission was still taught, and from there spread into the Himalayas. So we know that Karma Lobsang taught the oral transmission of Samvara to some of his main pupils who were active all along the borderlands. He himself founded two temples in the Himalayas, one in Dolpo and one in Nishan, and entrusted it to local-born disciples. One of them was Ngawan Namgyel, who you see is depicted down here, and so is most probably the donor for this painting. And all around him, you can see the whole lineage starting from Vajradhara. Here is Milarepa, Rechungpa. And here we also have Tsanyon Heruka, gTsang Rechen, and Hlatsun Rinchen Namgyel. So we see this was most probably produced in Dolpo, because also we know the context more or less of production of this tanka. And so you see that the lineage of this, so the school memory, the school's tradition, the teaching tradition was diffused all along the Himalayas. There is another painting that I discuss in the book, which also has the whole lineage, school lineage, and as can be traced in the Senyeg, so in the text which records the teachings received on Dawan Namgyel. And there are many others, at least I know of at least 3 other paintings very similar to this one, which also have the whole lineage, depict the whole lineage around the main central figure, including then Tsanyon Heruka and gTsang Rechen. So from Mangyu, we have the tradition spreading as far as Dolpo, and here you have a picture of Namgung, which was headed by Dawan Namgyel in Dolpo. What I try to do in the book is to retrace the development of the school until this 18th century late diffusion in the borderlands. So after a treatment of the life of Tsanyon and of his main his main deeds, I try to map the school based on some of the documents. So this prayer that I have mentioned to the different disciples, which is called Treasure Trove Granting Blessings, some records of donations for the restoration of specific buildings like the Swayambhu Chaitya, but also the printing colophons of the work, as well as 2 travel documents that were written by Tsanyon for his disciples that were traveling among the 3 snowy mountains of Sambara. Then I talk about the community that developed in Western Tibet, so in Mangyul Guntang and in Latu, and the main teachers, so Kuntung Sammo, of which we have a full-length biography with songs, but unfortunately that has no day or very little or no dates in it. But that provides an idea of how she show the way forward to the community, and also shows us how important her role was. So she's the first one that is praised right after Tsanyon Heruka in this prayer, for example, in the Treasure Trove Granting Blessings. And she's revered as root teacher by gTsang Rechen. Then we have Lopan and Hlatsun Rinchen Namgyel, of which I have spoken, but also other pupils of Tsanyon that were active in the West. In particular, I mentioned Osel Puk, which was, and Bekze Döye, who were also, at least for the first 2 generations, led by disciples or grand disciples, so to speak, of the master. But afterwards, we lose a little bit the traces of the Abhasha or the Sikh succession there. Chapter 5 is devoted to gTsang Rechen, Rechung Puk, and the texts that he composed and printed. And then in chapter 6, I follow especially the succession lineages at Rechung Puk and Drakartartso and the diffusion in the Himalayas. So from Sherpa region to Yolmo to Dolpo and Nishan. afterwards, I provide 3 sources in edition and translation. So an excerpt from A Heap of Jewels. This was written by a disciple of Lopan Rinchen, and it's a full chodron, so a full history of the Kagyu, basically of the teachings, but is focused on the Kagyu teachings. And at the end, it ends with the community of Sanyong and the community of his disciples, and also provides some, and it's here that we find also some information on the main disciples, including Lopan Rinchen. So this section I have translated here. I have translated the colophon of the Radiance of Wisdom, which is the life story of Rinpoche, composed and printed in Rinpoche by gTsang Rinchen that I mentioned. And finally, this excerpt from the succession of abbots of Dragartarso. At the end of the book, I provide detail. I'm sorry for the bells. I don't know if you hear them, but yeah, they're quite loud on my side at this time of the day. At the end, I provide a hand list where I describe the non-extant printed works of the school. So this is not a bibliography of everything that we know was compiled or printed by this community. This I discuss in the study, but this is a description of those editions of which we have extant copies. In the book, I was able to describe 82 printed editions, of which we have from 1 to maybe multiple, sometimes even up to maybe 8 or 10 extant copies. But in the meanwhile, for example, I found out that there are 2 more. So this kind of data is always growing. The hand list is divided into different groups. So the first 5 groups describe editions that come from localizable workshops and that have common physical characteristics. So there are 5 editions that come from the Tibri region, so from Latole, and that are the earliest ones of the group. Then we have editions prepared also in Latole between Tibri and Yanang by Lopan Rinchen and his disciple Sangye-darpo, including this Chojun, the Heap of Jewels that I mentioned, that I partly of a section of which I translated in the book. We have 19 editions prepared by gTsang Rinchen, which were all printed at Rinpoche, except for the biography of Sanyong Heruka, which was printed at Dakpo Gyel. So possibly before gTsang Rinchen took the lead of Rinpoche. We have 25 editions of works printed by Hlatsun Rinchen Namgyel. Some of them don't have extensive printing colophons, but those that have mentioned that they were printed at Dragartarso, and they were all produced with similar physical characteristics and by the same artisans. We have 9 editions of produced in Mangyul Guntang and Kirong by Jampa Pinsog, who was the main disciple of both gTsang Rinchen and Hlatsun Rinchen Namgyel. And then other printing projects which were initiated by members of the school and that don't belong to these 5 groups. So these are sparse, different individual printing projects that I was able to trace. And finally, there are 9 hagiographical sources of members of the school, which come from, also were produced in different places. So this is more or less what an entry looks like. So there are information on the physical aspects of the book, on the people involved in its production, and also on the available copies of the book. And then I provide the full colophons, printing colophons, which, as I mentioned, since they given a kind of overview of the community that contributed to these works, and then that was involved with it, are a very important source for historical information on the early generations of Sangyon's, Heruka's followers. So the book tries to give an appraisal of the impact that Sangyon and his followers, so of what this reform movement had on the Tibetan religious landscape of the time. And as I mentioned, I believe that this remained a kind, even though it was it developed within the Kagyu school, and we know that at least until the 17th century, the Karma Kagyu hierarchs were involved in determining the succession at the head of both Drakartarso and Rechumpuk. It remained a kind of distinctive community, or a distinctive movement, which taught and transmitted a specific set of teachings, which is the oral transmission of Sambara. Although at some point, let's say around the 17th century, also became intermingled or blended with or superposed with transmission lineages of cycles of treasures of the Mima school. And as such, it was diffused in the Himalayan borderlands, where it continued to flourish for another century or so. By the 19th century, we know that the oral transmission was no longer very well known and or widely practiced, and we also know that the specificity of this religious community was starting to fade. However, some of the main elements of this cultural program, if one wants to call it like that, or anyway of this cultural complex that was created in the first generations of the school, remained very popular within and spread throughout the Kagyu, the different Kagyu schools or lineages. The hagiographical works became the standard reference works for the life of Milarepa, Rechungpa, but also other teachers. And also this idea of the Kagyu hermit, or the Kagyu of the ideal Kagyu hermit, practicing the tantras in the Himalayan hermitages, of course, became a kind of identitary mark for the whole movement and the whole school. So I think I will stop here, and then if there are any questions, we can maybe I can go more in detail if you're interested in knowing more about the specific topic.